Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the World Art Center tonight for the discussion by Miloon Kothari on the realization of human rights in India. We're very lucky to have Miloon here in Vancouver for the fourth time. Miloon gave a talk on Monday night on the right to adequate housing. He previously, in 2007, did a country report on Canada, and as he's been going around doing various meetings with the city and civil society organizations, he revealed to me that despite the fact that it's his fourth trip to Vancouver, he has yet to be able to get to Stanley Park because the schedule is so full. So he's got one more day after this. We're SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement is very happy to be partnering with SFU Public Square and also the Indian Summer Festival, which has been happening the second year in a row in partnership with SFU. Before I introduce the moderator, I wanted to invite Suresh Rao, the Artistic Director of Indian Summer, to tell us about the upcoming events that are still going to be happening. Welcome, Suresh.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, warm welcome. Thanks for making it out here, surviving the cyclists. I mean, I'm a cyclist myself. I love cyclists, but cyclists are the truckers of the pedestrian world for sure. And they're just like whizzing by. No, it's true, because just the other day we had Sharmila Tagore, the queen of Bollywood, this very elegant, refined woman who's been in cinema for 50 years, and we were walking down the seawall, and a cyclist gave her the finger, and like it was one of those moments. When you're like, I think he was waving to you, and she's like, "Oh, how sweet, how sweet." So, anyway, I'm not here to talk about cyclists. I tend to digress, but really, all I want to say is that we're very proud to have Miloon here, and thanks to and the Vancity Office of Community Engagement for making this possible. And this kind of starts off for us at Indian Summer, the second phase of our festival. Indian Summer is very clearly a festival of arts and ideas, and the ideas part, I think, for us is key to really try and find a place in Vancouver for a global dialogue. And we feel more and more that what happens in different parts of the world affects people everywhere, and we need to be part of a dialogue that is inclusive and global. And so pleased to have you here, Miloon, to kick this off. I just wanted to tell you about a couple of events coming up. Tomorrow, that's the Thursday at 7 p.m., we have MJ Akbar, who is a fascinating journalist, thinker, writer, and he's spent a lot of time thinking about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Islam-Christian conflict. So, which brings us to this huge topic, why is Osama bin Laden hiding in Pakistan, what's the repercussions of nuclear armament, so on and so forth. He's a fascinating speaker. On Friday, we have a concert of Sufi music, which again goes through these, falls between and outside the lines of religion and several cultures. And then on Saturday, we have the great feminist writer, thinker, and publisher Urvashi Butalia, who founded Kali for Women. And she'll be speaking about partition, about the women's movement in India, and her work in general. So they're all coming up. And tonight, I thank you once again, Miloon, for being here. And please stay longer next time in Vancouver. And thanks to you all for coming.
Thank you, Suresh. I also wanted to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. We're also very lucky this evening to have Charlie Smith moderating the discussion and the Q&A this evening. Most of you probably know Charlie Smith from the Georgia Strait. Prior to becoming the editor, he was the news editor of the Georgia Strait for more than a decade. And from 1998 to 2005, he taught investigative journalism at Kwantlen University College, where he focused a great deal of attention on reporting in a multicultural society. In addition, Charlie has worked as an associate producer at CBC Radio and researched and reported stories on CBC TV. I ask you to join me in welcoming Charlie Smith.
Thanks, and I just wanted to say, if this is your first Indian Summer Festival event, I would encourage you to attend more, because I took in several of them last year in the debut year, and it was absolutely fantastic. And I went to the Sharmila Tagore event as well out in Surrey, and it was, as Suresh was saying, she was elegant and charming and very intelligent. And we're fortunate tonight to have someone, I would use the same description, Miloon Kothari. He's the convener of the working group on human rights in India, or on India in the UN, I'm sorry, Miloon, and he was the UN Special Rapporteur on adequate housing from 2000 to 2008. And he wrote a report on Canada, which I was reading this week, which was very impressive and informative. In India these days, as people who are paying attention, there are a lot of human rights issues ranging from the Gujarat riots in 2002, the Naxalite rebellion that's taking place in many states across India and how it's being dealt with, extrajudicial killings, the fallout from the 26/11 attacks in Mumbai on the Taj Hotel and the Oberoi Hotel. So Miloon has been tracking kind of how the government's been responding, and I'm very interested to hear what he has to say. So he will be speaking for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then I will sit down and ask him a couple of questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And then afterward, there's going to be at W2, there's going to be a social media event where the discussion will continue. So with no further ado, I'll introduce Miloon Kothari.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and good evening, everyone. Let me first begin by welcoming the fact that the India Summer Festival was ready to allow me to speak. Festivals are not usually the places where you get a critical viewpoint. It's usually a celebration of the country's culture and arts and all that. And it's wonderful that there is this space available for me and for MJ Akbar and for Urvashi to give you perhaps another side of the country. There's much to celebrate in India, but there's increasingly much to condemn. And I'll speak about that, but also looking ahead to how we can change the very, very dire and drastic situation regarding a range of human rights in India. So I work with, Charlie was saying, the Working Group on Human Rights in India and the UN. This is an umbrella organization of 15 of the main human rights groups working across India and a number of independent experts working on human rights. We came together about 4 years ago. The purpose of forming such an umbrella organization was to hold the Indian government accountable to its national and international human rights obligations. And so we've been very active in pursuing that, particularly with the United Nations. And that's the second context of this talk this evening. The United Nations Human Rights Council 4 years ago initiated a new mechanism seeking accountability of states called the Universal Periodic Review. This is a peer review process where every member of the UN monitors and reflects upon and gives recommendations to their fellow members. Canada, of course, came up before this review in 2009 and will be coming up again in, next year. But this year, just a couple of months ago, India underwent this Universal Periodic Review. And what was striking was that in sharp contrast to the report that the Indian government presented to the UN, a range of reports, civil society reports, reports from independent institutions, reports from our national Human Rights Commission painted a very, very bleak picture of human rights in India, and almost unequivocally, all of them said that that the situation is worsening. So what I'm going to try to do this evening is, the lecture, the talk will be in 2 parts. One is I'll give you an overview of the state of human rights in the country, and then some thoughts on how we feel as a group we can overcome the crisis. Those of you who are interested more in this issue and who want to know more, there's much more much more detail than what I can do in one talk. And there's a large report that has come out this year called Human Rights in India Status Report, which is on wghr.org. And those of you who are more interested in the work of this working group, please come up to me afterwards, and I can explain to you more. So let me begin with the sort of hard reality of civil and political rights in India. We have a situation where, of course, due to historical reasons, parts of India, including the Northeast and Jammu and Kashmir, have witnessed insurgency for many years. The response of the government has been increased militarization. And despite a clear decrease in the insurgency in these areas, the state response has remained mainly militaristic and accompanied by draconian security laws that have led to widespread human rights violations. In these areas, but not only in these areas, also in central India, where there's a growing insurgency in states of Chhattisgarh, Andhra Pradesh, Jharkhand, Orissa, West Bengal. There's a range of laws that provide extensive powers of arrest, detention without trial, and power to shoot, to kill on suspicion. And this militaristic approach is very widespread, but it contradicts the government of India's consistent position at the UN and in other international forums that India does not face either international or non-international armed conflict. They don't consider this armed conflict, which is very odd. One of the most draconian legislations, some of you may have heard of it, is AFSPA. It's the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which provides sweeping powers and immunity to the armed forces and was imposed almost half a century ago. Fundamental rights, such as the right to life, the right to a fair trial, right to remedy and reparation, the right against torture are systematically violated in areas where this law exists. And notwithstanding strong criticisms from a number of Indian institutions, civil society, of course, and a number of UN bodies, including most recently the Universal Review at the Human Rights Council, the legislation continues. There are no attempts being made to either amend it or to repeal the legislation. The other area which is of great concern is custodial torture and violence. They remain entrenched and routine, and routine law enforcement and investigative practices across India. Of course, the practice of power is even more widespread and condoned in conflict areas. Most torture cases in India go unreported, and because victims fear reprisals. And even though India has ratified almost all the international human rights instruments, they haven't ratified the Convention Against Torture. And this was one of the main recommendations that came out of the Universal Periodic Review. The reason they give is that we don't have a national law against torture. There is a law that has been drafted, and it's currently before a parliamentary select committee, but it has been blocked from further progress for the last few years. The third area of concern is our enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings. These remain widespread in conflict areas, as I mentioned, reinforced by extraordinary powers of arrest, detention, and immunity available to the security forces. And India has not this is one other instrument. They haven't ratified the UN Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. The National Crime Bureau report 2010 reveals much higher incidences of police firing and resultant civilian casualties and injuries in all conflict zones. And the data, however, doesn't reflect the actual number of extrajudicial executions. Earlier this year, the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial and summary executions visited India, and one of his remarks in preliminary observations at the end of his mission was that the sort of criticism he made of this notion of fake encounters. This is very common in India, and he said, when this occurs, suspected criminals or those labeled as terrorists or insurgents are shot dead by the police and a scene of a shootout is staged. Those killed are then portrayed as the aggressors who had first opened fire, and the police escape legal sanction. So this remains a major problem. The phenomenon of fake encounters continues. So in the there are, I can go on. There's a number of other sort of very serious and very depressing issues around civil and political rights. But one of the impacts, which is a result of this, is the violence faced by a number of groups in India. The violence particularly faced by women. While we have a number of violence, generally violence against women is targeted, and atrocities committed include a range of issues. There are particular groups of women who are affected more. Dalit women are very sort of disproportionately high in this. When we look at who is targeted by violence, and we do have a number of laws. We have a Domestic Violence Act, which is actually quite progressive, but is hampered in its implementation by lack of resources. The other factor that works against women in India is discrimination. Discrimination is systemic in the country. It's embedded in socio-cultural norms and laws that structure family, community, workplace, and state policies. And family laws are codified with reference to religion and custom rather than rights given in our constitution. So there's a range of, there's much work that needs to be done in this area, including reform of family laws and laws that govern succession and inheritance of property. And there are a number of other groups. I wanted to particularly point out the situation of children in India. The situation is very, 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 very serious. Crimes against children have shown a 120% increase in a 10-year period between 1999 and 2009, and a 60% increase just in the, if you go from now, the last 5 years. We don't have comprehensive laws on child trafficking. There's a whole case of disappearances. The government of India actually states publicly that in any given year, an average of about 44,000 children are reported missing, out of which 11,000 remain untraced. And all of you will have heard of the persistence of child labor in India. India has the highest number of child laborers in the world. Majority of child laborers are Dalits, with many surviving on less than $1 a day. And there's a huge confusion about what should be done for children. The other group that is very, very severely affected, although there's been significant progress in recent years, are the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribe. So, this has been historically, they've been targets of acute discrimination. We have a very strong act called the Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act, which has been recently amended, so there's a higher compensation for crimes that are committed, but the crimes continue, and this issue has been continuously also brought up at the UN, but the position of India has consistently been that this is an issue we want to handle domestically. They say that the United Nations, of course, refers to caste-based discrimination as a form of racial discrimination. And India continues to take a position that caste is not race. And so there's this polemical kind of debate going on. We've been able to shift this now to saying, look, if we just take the fundamental human rights principle of non-discrimination in the realization of rights, then obviously from a non-discrimination viewpoint, there's much that needs to be condemned about the treatment of Dalits, and there's much that can be done using non-discrimination laws. The second area I wanted to talk about is the socioeconomic situation. It doesn't get any better here. If you look at statistics, it's very sobering. Around 450 million people live below the poverty line in India. And there's a national poverty rate of 37%, and I'll come back to this. This figure is very low. 50% of the world's hungry live in India. 46% of India's children are undernourished. This is the highest in the world, shockingly double that of sub-Saharan Africa. And our maternal mortality rate is amongst the highest in the world. According to an independent committee appointed by the government of India to study employment in the informal sector, about 77%, about 850 million people in India subsist on 20 rupees a day, which is about 40 cents a day. And 93% of the working population is employed in the informal sector, so they have no protection of labor rights, safety issues. About 130 million people are landless, and these families do not have land for their housing, habitation, and land reform measures have not been successfully implemented. And a large percentage of India's population lives in inadequate housing, and there's a huge problem of access to water and sanitation. What makes this, this sort of overall alarming situation and these alarming socioeconomic indicators actually point to two tragic contradictions, which I can say lie at the heart of India's tryst with democracy. I think this is, and if these issues are not resolved, it's difficult to imagine India continuing as a democracy as it is now. One of the issues is poverty. Poverty persists in India partly, and some say largely, because our economic policies, much like you have here, are driven by a neoliberal economic paradigm that perpetuates exclusion and in fact violates fundamental rights and directive principles that we have in our constitution. According to official figures, the average growth rate between 2007 and 2011 in India was 8%, but poverty, this is the official figure, only declined by 0.8%. And what is very disturbing are the standards used to measure poverty. The standards are very suspect. They are based on a poverty level of 50 cents a day, which is an absolute insult to the poor. And also they are, these poverty statistics are, even if you take those, it shows a significant number of people are poor. But the statistics are very controversial because they're based purely on income. And it's actually striking that given all the experience we've had around the world that in India we no longer, we measure poverty just by, if we, essentially what's striking is that when we talk about human progress across the world, we don't use the income as the only criteria. So it's striking, why do we then still use income as a measure of poverty? If we use the human rights approach and looked at, and this is something that's been done in a recent poverty index, inequality index developed by the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative and used by the United Nations Development Program in its Human Development Report of 2011, what they did is they looked at issues like years of schooling, child enrollment, mortality, nutrition, electricity, sanitation, drinking water, cooking fuel, asset ownership. And if you take these indicators into consideration, then 55% of India's population, 55% are poor. And of course, it's clear when you take that kind of assessment that many poor people face multiple deprivations, and even if they have reached a level of minimal income poverty line, they are not considered extremely poor by that yardstick. So there's a real need to move away from that by the policymakers in India and take a much more holistic view of poverty. And unless we are able to really understand the scale of the situation, how can we take the corrective measures that are necessary at the policy and legislative and administrative level? The second contradiction that I wanted to briefly speak about is the issue of displacement. According to one estimate, between 60 and 65 million people are estimated to have been displaced in India since independence. And the highest number of those displaced internally are because of development projects, large dams, mineral extraction, a range of infrastructure projects. And if you break this down, this amounts to around 1 million people displaced every year since independence. And again, disproportionately of all of these, 46% are tribals, are indigenous, and 40% are Dalits. Because of this large-scale displacement, of course, we've had rapid urbanization. But many of the people who get displaced from the rural areas are forced to come into the cities, face multiple displacements because they come into the city and they are forced to live in slums or on the streets. They're considered illegal and their homes are routinely demolished. And it's interesting when you look at the international perspective of, for example, the rights that refugees have. Refugees actually have more rights than people who are displaced by development projects in India. So you displaced and you come into the city, you have nowhere to go, no one to help you with your life. So displacement continues to be a major problem, and of all the people displaced, number of studies have shown that only about 20 to 25% receive resettlement and rehabilitation. The rest are just left to their own devices. So there's, and of course, this partly contributes to the national housing crisis that we have, with about 26 million units shortage in the country, and almost 99% of that is for economically weaker sections. And yet there are no comprehensive human rights policies. There is currently a draft before Parliament of a land acquisition and rehabilitation and resettlement bill, but it's not a rights-based legislation, and there's much work going on, particularly from civil society, to amend that draft before it goes on the floor of the Parliament. The other area in terms of these economic, social, and cultural rights is the right to food. I think many of you will have heard about the food situation in India. We have an enormous food entitlement program food subsidy schemes, public distribution schemes. And yet, in spite of something like 40 orders from the Indian Supreme Court, 21% of the population remains undernourished. And we've witnessed since, in the last 10 years, an alarming number of farmer suicides, which you will have heard about. And hunger amongst, it's an ironic thing that hunger amongst the producers of food is a reality in the country that ranks number 2 in the world in terms of farm production. So there's something horribly wrong. And we have oversupply of grains, and yet much of the grain rots away because the distribution system is very poor, very flawed, and there's a lot of corruption in that as well. We have a national food security bill, which is just going through its final stages. It's a very important step, but one of the shortcomings is that it fails to universalize public distribution system. The idea in the food security bill is you target groups that are the most hungry. So it's received a lot of criticism on that ground. I can go on about the right to health, the right to education, livelihood. We have a shockingly low, for example, we only spend about 4% of our national budget on health, which is far, far below the global median of around 11%. And health remains a major problem. There's growing privatization of healthcare, and until very recently, there was essentially no attempt made to establish what is called, in World Trade Organization language, compulsory licensing, making generic medicines available. But this has recently been done. There's been a radical step taken by the government to allow Indian companies to produce the same drugs. And in fact, just recently, a few weeks ago, the government announced that there would be universal health care in India and that medicines would be free for those that cannot, certain medicines will be free for everyone. So that's positive. One of the groups, this kind of a crisis of housing and health, food, affects many people across the country. But one of the groups I wanted to particularly mention are human rights defenders. One of the striking things in India today is that people who are defending rights are being increasingly targeted. There's counter-security legislation used against them. All sorts of harassment is there, including for people who are defending using what I consider one of the most progressive right to information acts in the world. We have a remarkable act which actually allows us to get just about any information from any government department, including file notings and so on. But the people who are using this act are often targeted. And most of them are not what we would consider traditionally human rights activists. They're ordinary people who want to know what is happening, and yet they're arrested, harassed. Some are killed every year. And earlier this year, last year actually, we had the visit of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, Margaret Sekagea, and she actually made a very interesting list of, she traveled around the country, took testimonies from human rights defenders, and she found defenders were working on who are being threatened, working on a range of issues, including those denouncing development projects, those fighting for land rights, defenders working on the issues of religious minorities, sexual minorities, defenders working on women and child rights, defenders seeking accountability for the large-scale ethnic riots, communal pogroms that we've had in the country, defenders upholding the rights of political prisoners, a range of other defenders. And so pervasive human rights violations compounded by the non-accountability of state actors and institutions have triggered the emergence of new groups of defenders. as I mentioned, made up of ordinary citizens and grassroots communities fighting for their rights, but they are being targeted, and so the situation becomes very difficult for people who are defending rights. So faced with such a situation, sort of what appears a very bleak situation, what is it that we can do? So what I'm going to try to sort of just formulate. What would be the contours of such a change? It's very clear that to meet India has to meet the human rights accountability challenge posed by its own constitution, which continues to be violated, and by the international instruments it has ratified. But to meet this enormous challenge, it's very clear that nothing but a radical shift in economic, security, and social policy is needed. The change is not going to come from piecemeal approaches. The change is not going to come from one law here, one policy there, but a radical rethinking is necessary. And I don't consider that to be a very sort of unachievable idea, because in spite of everything, India continues to remain a vibrant democracy. We have some remarkable independent institutions in the country, the Controller, Auditor General, the Election Commission, who are fiercely independent. Now the National Human Rights Commission, and we have many other strengths which I'll just come to. One of the sort of direct challenges for the government would be to implement court orders from the high courts, orders from the Supreme Court, to implement UN recommendations. If you look just at the recent Universal Periodic Review, the UN Human Rights Council recommend in that document that has come out, which still is being discussed, but the preliminary document recommends that India, ratifies the instruments against torture and for disappearances, that there are comprehensive reforms to address sexual violence and all acts of violence against women, improve training of police officers who are, often the oppressors, consider abolishing the death penalty. We still have the death penalty in India. Ban all forms of child labor, strengthen efforts towards addressing maternal and child mortality, strengthen efforts to combat trafficking, and address the inequities based on the rural and urban divide. So there are many recommendations that need to be taken forward. And in fact, one positive aspect of the Universal Periodic Review is that India actually has to go back to the Council, just as Canada now has to do for next year. India has to go back in 4 years and report progress. So it gives civil society in particular a good handle to hold the government accountable. The second area which we have been, as a working group, discussing quite regularly with our foreign ministry and our home ministry is that we need to see a change in the way in which India approaches the international community and the UN. We need to see a change from the current very defensive position and the current sort of routine answers that India gives whenever problems are raised. Oh, but we have this policy, we have this law. To move from that to be a more strident approach. And there are some signs of this. Just recently this year, for the first time in history, India actually voted for a resolution which pointed out, at the Human Rights Council, which pointed out the serious human rights violations that have taken place in Sri Lanka. And this was a major step forward because it's sort of consistent with India's democratic values that are grounded in justice and accountability. And India has offered an open invitation UN rapporteurs. They're accepting rapporteurs with almost any mandate. And there is a shift in our foreign policy, which is very welcome. Part of it is a result of course, a lot of civil society work, but also because we have aspirations to become a member of the Security Council. We have aspirations to be counted amongst as one of the big boys at the international level, to sit at all the tables. But also there is a recognition that we cannot continue to be a global player or to have global aspirations if we do not improve our human rights situation. Because unlike in China, in India you cannot hide anything. There's a tremendous amount of scrutiny by civil society. It's a democratic country, so you can get information if you want. The other area that there needs to be a change is that the government needs to acknowledge and work with civil society. India has some absolutely amazing civil society groups, national campaigns that are working on the right to food, on child labor, on the rights of construction workers, the right to information campaign, the work on housing, the campaign on discrimination against Dalits, and so on. And there's a need to be much more open to these campaigns, to have much more constructive engagement, and to accept the recommendations that are coming from these campaigns. And some of the laws that I was mentioning, the Right to Information Act, for example, is a direct result of these campaigns, which actually started at the grassroots level. The other promising aspect is that we have some very good human rights institutions. I mentioned the National Human Rights Commission. We also have a commission on scheduled castes, which is doing some very progressive monitoring and other work. And we have commissions at the state level, which are not very effective and very ill-resourced, but the institutional basis is there. And finally, we have our youth. It's quite remarkable in this era of materialism and everything that we still find. I travel across the country, youth that are very active, that are out on the streets, that are organizing, that are speaking out against injustice, that are coming from all parts of the country, including villages and small towns. And India is a very young country in that sense, demographically, and so it's quite promising if this becomes a sort of a groundswell. So that's, I'm just throwing out these ideas. I think there are many more positives that we can think about, and we are all engaged. We are at least able to speak to our government, which is not possible in many countries. And I'm optimistic that the work that is being done at the UN by civil society, by independent institutions, will and the recognition by the government that there needs to be a radical change will lead to a more positive future for the millions in India whose rights continue to be violated. Thank you very much.
No, I was taping what Miloon had to say so I can write a story on our website. And thanks for that presentation. I have lots of questions, but I'll give a chance for the audience to ask questions as well. One of the first questions I have, Miloon, is you were talking about human rights defenders being targeted, and you're obviously a very high-profile human rights defender yourself, and I'm wondering whether you've faced any consequences as a result of speaking out about these issues.
Yeah, they're probably monitoring what I'm doing here in Canada, but no. Well, yes, the work that we do is closely monitored. We know perhaps, I'm not sure, perhaps our phones are tapped, but I haven't directly, received any threats. I think part of the reason is that they usually don't go after people who have who have a profile. And one of the reasons why our working group has been successful to an extent is because the leadership of the human rights organization consists of people who have a lot of credibility, who are nationally known, who can very quickly mobilize the international community. And I think that might be a reason. But the other reason, of course, is that I think it's like you have here in Canada, all the ministries, government departments have bureaucrats who are very sincere, who are actually on our side. And so we don't have a sort of governance system where the entire block of government officials would be saying, well, let's go after these people. But what I'm saying should not hide the fact that the thousands of human rights defenders who don't have that kind of a reach, and particularly in the rural areas, because nobody even knows what happens to them, they are continuously being targeted, and that's a major concern, which the rapporteur also tried to bring out.
Among the diaspora, particularly here in Greater Vancouver, there's a great concern about Punjab and what happened in 1984 in Delhi with the riots targeting Sikhs and the claims that there hasn't been much accountability against, in some cases, Congress party leaders who may have played a role in that. And I'm wondering to what extent this is an issue in India and whether you foresee any chance of accountability taking place down the road.
Well, the justice system is very slow in the country, and many people use that to, sort of delay accountability. But there are still, high-profile cases going on in the High Court in many parts of the country against people who are accused of either the Sikh riots in '84 or the Gujarat riots. And more recently, the Kandhamal, the riots against the Christian community in Orissa. So there are cases going on, but and in some situations, politicians have been convicted. But the process is very slow because in almost all these cases, there were politicians who were involved, and there was, even tacit or even direct involvement of chief ministers of certain states. So, the struggle continues. But what is also disturbing about these ethnic riots that we've had is the fact that after, many, many years, if you look at the situation, particularly in Gujarat, people continue to live in camps. They've not been able to go back to their homes because it's insecure for them to do that. And so that sort of restitution process hasn't occurred, and that's a major concern as well.
One of the things I think people abroad have trouble comprehending is how Narendra Modi could be the chief minister of Gujarat after what happened and how he's managed to remain in power for so long. What can you tell us about why he's still there and what accounts for his political longevity in light of the human rights record?
Well, there are many reasons. He's part of the reason, I think a large part of the reason is that the government at the central level, at least in the last 10 years, has not been secure. They've been mostly coalition governments. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to, directly confront the major opposition party to which Narendra Modi belongs, Bharatiya Janata Party. And so there's been a reluctance on their side. The other factor that has worked in favor of Narendra Modi is that he has embarked on a very rapid sort of industrialization process in Gujarat and has gained a lot of support, particularly from the diaspora, who think he's a champion of India's development policy, and he's someone. His policies are something that you need to emulate across the country. But inside India, his credibility is less and less every year. he's, there's still cases going on and people have testified against him. There's a lot of evidence that he was directly involved. And the party itself that he belongs to, at one point, they were even projecting him to be their prime ministerial candidate. But they no longer do that. And they actually keep him
You were
away.
joking before, maybe like George Bush.
Right. So I think, I like to think his days are numbered. I don't know whether he'll ever be, convicted in court, but perhaps, if not in India, hopefully at the international level. We have a very robust system in the international level now, and if evidence can be brought, I think there is sufficient evidence against him.
One of the biggest issues in India these days is the Naxalite rebellion, or Maoist rebellion, as it's sometimes called, and taking place over several states. And last year at Indian Summer, Taran Tejpal was saying some somewhat positive things about how the national government had moderated its response and was not being as abusive on the human rights side. And I'm wondering what your take is on that.
Well, I'm surprised that Tarun said that. Actually, the evidence is very much to the contrary, because the government continues to employ, paramilitary forces. In fact, there's a recent Supreme Court judgment which has called the government, which said the government should disband this one particular force, Al-Wajidum. And what is very striking when you visit these areas, and actually insurgency is increasing, by the way. It's
Which states is it taking place in now?
It's primarily Chhattisgarh, but also Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal, and it's sort of spreading.
Is it reaching Maharashtra on the west, or?
Part of Maharashtra, actually. That's one of the fears, that it's going to, spread into other states that have been free from insurgencies. But what is very important to recognize is that the rationale that the Naxal groups, the Maoist groups, always used was that we are fighting for the tribals, for the indigenous people, and because there has not been development in those areas. But then, they started using violent means, and the situation in a large part of these areas now is that the tribals are caught in between. They're caught in between the government forces and the Naxals and the Maoists, and that's and one aspect the government has acknowledged, and this is something that our rural development minister, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, has been actually quite radical in his statement, saying that yes, we have failed those areas since independence. There's been very little development. There's great poverty. And we need to do something about that. So instead of going in with a military or a militaristic response or heavy police response, perhaps the way to do it is to very rapidly bring in development in these areas. And some steps are being taken in that direction. What results it will show is not yet clear. But at this moment, the insurgency is growing.
One of the things is India is kind of in a rough neighborhood. If you look around, you've got, you had civil war in Sri Lanka for a generation. You've got ongoing problems in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
Nepal is not exactly stable and democratic. And then Pakistan is, you could make the case it's becoming a failed state. And Afghanistan is in a mess too. And so given this reality...
And let's not forget China.
Yeah, and then there's China, which is not exactly a human rights, paragon of human rights. So, and you had Burma as well. So I'm just curious with Pakistan particularly, and with groups like LET sending suicide bombers into India, and you were talking about the Convention Against Torture, and why India hasn't signed on to this. To what degree do you think India is refusing to sign the UN Convention Against Torture because it wants to have a free hand to deal with some of the problems that might be coming across the border?
I don't think there's a link there, because as I mentioned, there's a very advanced draft of a national act against torture, which I think eventually will be passed, and it's quite a progressive act, and I mean many of us feel it's quite consistent with the international instrument. So at some point in the next year or two, I expect that to be, we will ratify the Convention Against Torture. But certainly the very insecure geopolitical situation in the region, and when you take a comparative, sort of relative perspective, India comes out looking good,
it looks
right?
Great in comparison.
But that's small consolation to people who are undergoing the violations.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not. And of course, that's often used as an excuse to keep the strong security legislation, and it's often used as an excuse to say that we need a strong army. One of the responses we get when we meet with senior officials and say, well, this Armed Forces Special Powers Act makes no sense at all, one of the responses is, yes, it probably should be repealed or amended, as has been recommended by various UN bodies. But one of the responses is that we don't want to destabilize our army at this stage when we are facing so much hostility from outside as well. And the particular concern is with our northern borders, particularly with China.
Yeah.
Because China has been sort of,
I'll ask one more question, then I'll invite questions from the audience. And this question concerns, significant movement from rural to urban that's taking place in India right now. And I'm wondering what the consequences are from a human rights perspective when you have migration of that magnitude to cities.
Well, the consequences are quite severe. I mean, we see in our cities, some of our cities have 40 to 50% of the populations living in the slums. As I mentioned, we have, people being evicted from their homes all the time. And one of the other consequences, which is really striking, and a lot of people are surprised, is that we have very debilitating levels of poverty in our cities, which was not there before, because people did find work and there was. But now we have pockets of poverty which are, as bad or worse than we've had in rural areas, which is saying a lot. So that's one of the consequences. There's been a slight shift demographically in the sense that rapid migration to the mega cities has actually come down. And a lot of the migration now is taking place to what we call class 2, 3, and 4, sort of medium and small towns.
Can you give examples of what would Hyderabad be a class 2 or class 1? Or?
Hyderabad is class 2.
Yeah.
And, there are other cities like Patna and, the range of other cities, and Meerut, other cities. But the problem there is that these small and medium towns are, there's no planning. So they very quickly become a mess, and so they very quickly deteriorate. There's a lot of traffic pollution, slums come up everywhere, and so there's certainly a consequence of that. Some of our programs, like the National Rural Urban Guarantee Scheme, NREGA, has slowed migration a bit because one of the main reasons for migration was lack of livelihood. But there are a lot of problems with that act, and ironically, we don't have a similar, progressive government program in the urban areas. So we don't have a employment guarantee scheme in the urban areas, which is quite striking.
So does anyone have any questions? Yes, this gentleman on the right.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your knowledge. I have two questions. One is, thank you. My question is about human rights. Many times people talk about human rights without talking about army rights. And they seem to be, like even in Canada and all over the world, army is getting much more resources and so on at the expense of social programs and so on. I think you might learn a lot about Canadian experience of the funds being diverted. So I was wondering whether you can talk about the rights of the army vis-a-vis human rights, because the army is used to suppress the human rights. And my second question is about the role of culture, because India, Pakistan, all these countries are very good at promoting love and peace with their qawwalis and dances and so on, unlike Hollywood maybe. But yet, it seems like that thing happens at night and violence stays in during the daytime. Is there any correlation between the culture part of peace and violence and hugging each other or dancing behind the trees and the army? Maybe the army can learn some of these songs and practice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Well, the army is, Bollywood likes the army. There are lots of films about the army. I think when you speak about army rights, that's different from human rights we're talking about, right? You're not talking about the human rights of the army. You're talking about the sort of access that they have. And it's true, they have a lot of resources. They're constantly buying, fighter jets and fancy armaments and so on. But again, that goes back to the earlier question. The rationale for that is that we face a very difficult situation on our borders. So that's but the evidence actually points to, for example, one very difficult thing to understand is, if I can go back to this Armed Forces Special Powers Act, is that even in areas of the country where insurgency has considerably reduced or completely disappeared, like, I'll give you one example, the state of Nagaland, the act continues to be in operation. So there's something, that there's something happening there, which is, and the Ministry of Defense, even if we can get other ministries like the Home Ministry and others, and the Home Minister has in fact publicly said we need to do something about this act. The Ministry of Defense refuses to discuss it. So there is one good thing, if we can call it good, I don't know, is that in India, unlike in Pakistan and other countries, the army has been, at least that was a major step taken after independence, that the army has been completely apolitical and doesn't get involved in any kind of what you hear about and see in other countries. So that's one positive aspect. But certainly they have access to a lot of resources and they carry a lot of weight. And there is a certain, they're constantly also playing up the patriotic part and saying, we're protecting the country and we have to support our soldiers and so on. Your second question is more interesting. I think that, of course, the role of culture is very important. In India, we have an incredible diversity of arts, crafts, film. In fact, Bollywood is only one. We have lots of other regional cinema. Some of it is very good. And of course, when you look at when you only see that, you get a totally distorted view of India. And in fact, when you dig a little deeper, the very people that we celebrate, whether it's craftspeople, whether it's sort of people at the village level who are involved in theater, who are involved in musicians, they're all many are very poor. I mean, they don't get, even very famous village musicians don't get the kind of financial and other support that you would find is common in countries like Canada and elsewhere. But the other interesting aspect about culture is that the kind of resistance that is there in the country from, civil society movements, there's a lot of artistic expression. So, for example, we have a lot of street theater. We have a lot of sort of work with youth on, educating people about human rights violations. So many of the cultural sort of expressions that we have are also used as in forms of resistance, which is a very powerful means of getting the message across. So, culture has two sides. But one other aspect I would bring up is that very often people in India, like Shashi Tharoor and others, often speak about that India should project its soft power, and by that they mean
Canada talks that way sometimes.
Oh, really?
In a previous time.
Okay.
Before the current government.
But and that means our culture, our civilization, our music, our whatever. But I mean, I wouldn't really subscribe to that, because just saying that hides the reality. I mean, we might be a soft power, but that doesn't mean that people on the ground have power, and I think that's what we're
that's a soft power with a very large army. Is there another a question here on the front, on the right?
Thank you for coming to Canada and speaking to all of us. Such a pleasure to meet you. My question is, India is right now one of the fastest growing economies along China. And despite of the fact that we are having more jobs and the development is taking place, do you not think that that's going to help the poor or the low-income people to get more jobs? Does that not contribute to the economic and social conditions in India at this point in time? And my second question is, if you can please shed some light on an event or a movement where all the human rights activists, or most of the human rights activists, got together and pushed an issue which actually became successful, and people did get success in pushing it forward. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very valid question. When you look at the macro picture, of course, India's economy is growing, although in the last 2 years there's been a significant slowdown, and we in fact have a economic crisis of our own, which the government doesn't acknowledge. But if you look just at the level of price rise, the level of inflation, it's very, very high and difficult to sustain. In fact, it's brought the very optimistic growth rate. They were saying 8%, 10%, all that. They're not saying that anymore. But the question actually relates to the point I was making about. See, the approach is a very neoliberal approach, right? So, in spite of there being no evidence anywhere around the world that it has worked, there's still this belief amongst our policymakers that there will be a trickle down, right? Or that a rising tide lifts all boats, and all this stuff that they keep saying. But there's little evidence of that, because when you look, one very striking indicator, I don't have the exact figures, is of income inequality. In fact, this is something that's, I think, not been studied enough in Canada. There's some move towards that now. But that's a really good indicator of how the country is doing in terms of whether the economic wealth is spreading or not. And whatever work has been done in India shows that, well, no surprise, the rich have become richer, the poor have become poor. We have, I don't know how many millionaires. And if you go to the Indian cities, you see the kind of, I would consider obscene levels of development of, 5 shopping malls in a row, you have, huge infrastructure, and right next to that we have slums with thousands of people. So there's, I don't think that is correct. And in fact, India likes to project itself as a growing economic power. And one of the reasons they want to do that is because they want investment. But we have, strange kinds of investment. We have something, some of you may have heard of a project called POSCO in Orissa. POSCO is a South Korean multinational company that, produces steel. And there's no benefit from that project for the local people. There's little benefit for the country, actually, except for, some memory investment. And yet, so we're going in for these kinds of projects because we want to project ourselves as to the world, please come and invest in India. But either in places where sort of this mega investments are taking place, or nationally, that wealth, those resources are certainly not getting to the poor. In fact, the poor are, as I was saying, are being displaced more and more.
And was there a question in the back there? I'll
Yes,
get you
actually,
next.
Thanks. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting lecture. And actually a follow-up question to the one that we just had. As you mentioned, in the sort of free market capitalist system that's now prevalent in India, when you have a growing disparity in wealth and the rich are getting grossly richer and the poor are staying stagnant or getting poorer, you are getting a lot of super wealthy. And my question is do you have a philanthropic class that's growing in the new super wealth? Are there super philanthropists in the Buffett vein or the Gates vein? And if that's not the case, if you don't see emergence of super philanthropists in this new era of super wealth, do you have a rationale as to why?
Well, historically we've had some of our large corporations, Indian corporations, which are now multinational as well, like the Tata Group. They've always had a very strong philanthropic arm where they've contributed. And ironically, the Tata Group, through its education fund and so on, actually support human rights organizations, which is actually strange because many of their projects violate human rights. But anyway, that's fine. And of course, but we don't see the kind of what you term super philanthropic, people who are very, very rich. I mean, we don't have anyone like Bill Gates, or we don't have those types of people yet. And I think part of the reason is that there is, of course, a strong sort of voluntary sector in India. There are a lot of people who give their time, to help others. But there is a certain selfishness that is there right now. There's a certain thing of gaining profits and not putting it back into the country. So I think on a sort of per capita basis, I would say there was a study done recently. India, the wealth that is there nationally from people who are super rich is not really being. There are a few instances, but it's not a trend that they are contributing. There are instances. You may have heard there's sort of some Bollywood stars who give aid and all that, but it's not at a level that you are speaking. It's not like a institutionalized phenomenon, and that's actually quite disturbing. Many of us, for example, for our work, have to get funds from abroad, and it shouldn't be that way. There is enough wealth in the country that we should be able to raise funds domestically.
So Mukesh Ambani isn't cutting you a check?
No, I wouldn't take one from him, but...
Okay. Now, you have a question on the front row?
Actually, I wanted to ask, you mentioned several times that people are being targeted, or groups of people from the civil society are getting targeted. I apologize because I'm not Indian and I don't know very much about Indian politics. It's just a question for me that who is targeting them? Is it the government, or is it like local governments? Because on the other hand, you mentioned that you have a democratic society, and then you are optimistic about the government. So I'm a little bit confused. Who is targeting these groups?
Well, the large part of the targeting is of course done by police. It's done by government forces using whatever legislations exist, or just intimidating people. But targeting is also done by individuals. We've had human rights defenders killed by individuals who felt threatened that, for example, if someone is looking for a right to information, trying to get information on land holdings of a particular landlord who owns a lot of land. Is it possible to lower there? Or, it's actually that side.
It's the far right, the one on the far right there, yeah.
I love to see the sun in Vancouver, but this is a... thanks. So of course there are private reprisals as well to try to stop that kind of work, and some very high-profile human rights defenders have been assassinated, and we don't know who's done it. So there are investigations going on. But the point I was trying to make is that actually it's the role of the government and our Human Rights Commission and so on to protect defenders, right? If you are doing something where you are fighting for your legitimate rights, there should be a form of protection. And there's some discussion about a bill, actually, to a law for that type of protection, but not much has happened there. But instead of doing that, our National Human Rights Commission now has a sort of a desk that deals on human rights defenders, and they take up cases and so on. But it's, they're not making much of a dent. But the government should actually be, particularly if people are using national legislation to fight for their rights, why should the government not protect them? Why should actually the police should be protecting them instead of harassing them? Yes, yes, exactly. But you have to understand that in India we have, it's very schizophrenic almost, that you have arms of the government that are very helpful and you have others that are not. So, for example, you have some of our ministries will actually give you funds to critique what they're doing, right? I mean, that's democracy as well. But then there are other parts of the same ministry who will go after you or who will try to, intimidate you. So it's a very confusing situation, and you have to sort of strike a balance and try to play those cards. But overall, as far as human rights defenders are concerned, the situation continues to get worse because, it's sort of, as rights violations increase, the number of defenders increase, and if you don't have a sort of legal framework in the country or a protective framework, then there will be reprisals. But it's very, very disturbing that this is happening. It's happening a lot against, we've had several cases recently of women who are fighting for their land rights in Uttar Pradesh who were, arrested and no charges, just arrested. So that's, I think it's all comes down to a question of land, of resources, of some people not respecting democracy.
And is there a question in the back? Here?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
I just wanted to share a strange definition of human rights. 2009, we were attacked by terrorists from Pakistan, and one terrorist was caught, Ajmal Kasab.
Yes, right.
He continues to languish in Indian jail. The government spends about close to $500,000 every month protecting him. The justices go slow. And the same government or the same setup doesn't even bat an eyelid to send in troops to Kashmir, to troops to Chhattisgarh, to troops to anywhere else. And this is a really strange paradox, really, when we try and understand what human rights are. There's been so many movements done in India to at least get this terrorist thing, Ajmal Kasab thing, into limelight. And why is this happening? So for a common man, there is human rights for a foreigner, an alien on Indian soil, but there is no human rights for an Indian in our own soil.
Well, you're right. I mean, that is a major contradiction. And the main reason is because the whole world is watching what happens with Kasab, and whether, the rule of law or the process of justice is followed as it should be for everyone, even for convicted criminals. We cannot have a system where, you handle things outside of the law. So, that's the reason, but you're absolutely right. That contradiction is there.
Okay, we'll have two more questions. So the gentleman here.
Could you rate the media on how well they've informed about human rights in India? And I'm just thinking about two cases myself of Vendrati Roy over the years, years back, and then Vandana Shiva and how she's perceived there versus how she's perceived here. And I don't know, my mom keeps talking about some gentleman named Amir Khan that keeps informing everybody. She says that he's the kind of information guy, but I don't know about that. And then the next one is there a place in a bioregion in India that you believe that's doing a better job in human rights than others? And I remember about 14 years ago, I went to a talk by Dr. Rees from UBC, who talked about ecological footprint, and he looked at Kerala as one of the models of the world. And I went there about 8 years ago, and I've only been there for 10 days, so it's hard to tell, but it was one of those places from the rest of India, even though it's highly densely populated, you were seeing some real progress in, like, for my ancestors are from Punjab, you had 6 hectares of land, versus there you were seeing people that had 1 hectare of land and well distributed. Better healthcare system than the other parts,
right.
And food that was being distributed, and education. I don't know if that's changing, So that was my question, if that bioregion, if there is a bioregion that's better than others.
Well, your first question about the media. Actually, the media has been, by and large, quite supportive. We have very strong investigative journalism in India. Our newspapers are much better than yours. There's much more analysis. And when we go to the major national newspapers, they do cover human rights stories very regularly. This report, for example, has been extensively covered, and the media houses have challenged the government using that data and those case studies. And I actually didn't get your question about Arundhati and Vandana. What was the point you were making?
When I was there, I read about how long those cases went.
Right.
Beyond something that nobody did any investigation onto those.
Yeah.
I heard Arundhati was up on, they were talking about treason too, is that?
Yeah. I think that's over now, but yeah, she was, the Supreme Court actually took her on for what she was saying. But there hasn't been a similar thing with Vandana. But it's true that, Vandana perhaps to a certain lesser extent, but Arundhati certainly, how she's viewed abroad, for a lot of people, she seems to be this great symbol of resistance and everything done very poetically and in a literary manner. But her credibility in India is not the same. In fact, many of us feel that she's too shrill in her voice. Many of us feel that she's, constantly condemning and critiquing, and perhaps the state needs to be condemned and critiqued. But we all also feel that we should be constructive, we should offer solutions, we should try to have a dialogue with the state. And so, there is a difference in the way some people are viewed abroad and some are viewed at home. In terms of, parts of India, Kerala certainly is an excellent example of how land reform was done, how wealth is distributed, education, health, all of that. There's some sort of features that are appearing now because there's a lot of Gulf money pouring in. A lot of Keralites went to work in the Gulf. And there is some, sort of inequity that's coming in between people who use that wealth to build fancy houses and things and others who don't have access to that. But by and large, it remains a major success story. But it's very difficult to emulate in different parts of the country because of the political and other systems. There are many other parts of India where Bihar currently actually has some really rapid changes, things that we didn't expect, the way in which they've attacked corruption, the way in which the whole issue of Dalit rights has been dealt with. Dalits generally in that state now feel, because there's been a lot of political representation as well. So there's sort of good stories all over the country. But the overall trends are not very encouraging.
And the final question from the back row.
Hi, thank you. I have a quick question. So, and listening to you talk about human rights and democracy in India, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on this idea of imperial democracy that's starting to get developed, particularly in academic and international discourse. So this idea that countries like Israel and India and the United States that we know as liberal democracies or representative democracies and who have all these kinds of standard hallmarks of freedom of the press and representation in political democracy in elections, but increasingly engaging in policies of imperial democracy. So the kind of state warfare, the internal lack of human rights, the upholding of human rights, the lack of economic progress, and that the extent to which neoliberalism is taking hold. And so I'm thinking particularly to the work of Chandra Mohanty and others who are increasingly classifying countries like India as imperial democracies to kind of capture the contradictions, if you will, of having a state that is politically democratic but is fundamentally actually in many ways undemocratic. And I'm wondering if that is something or an idea that you engage with at all, or what you think
I mean, I wouldn't entirely agree with that. I think there's a huge difference between, I mean, it's difficult to compare India, Israel, and the US. I mean, we have, I mean, the kind of democracy that we have, that kind of a sort of, those kinds of democratic institutions, that level of civil society, the ability to, you know, get out there and protest in so many different ways, the ability to use the courts, the public interest litigation. I mean, there's a range of the Right to Information Act I was referring to is starkly different from what is possible to do in Israel and the United States. I mean, where you may be right is that there is a sort of reaching out to say that, okay, we aspire to be a superpower, so, you know, don't mess with us. I mean, that's been one of the kind of bullying factors at the UN for many years, although it's not there anymore in the last few years. But that kind of an imperial, but I would not classify India as that, and I would certainly not use the word imperial. I think there are a lot of other forces in the country that are managing, and you know, in spite of everything the government, we can critique the government, there are a lot of you know, sobering instances as well. We could have been far more neoliberal. We could have had far less regulated banks, for example, but there were always checks and balances, you know, and there's always this huge issue of constituency, because in India, I mean, the elections are a very vibrant form of expression, and governments can just fall. I think people have repeatedly thrown out governments that were not, you know, not doing the right things. So I think there is in that sense, the democracy works, and so I wouldn't necessarily subscribe to that.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Miloon. This has been highly enlightening, and one of the reasons why I enjoy the Indian Summer Festival, and congratulations to Laura Bespalko and Suresh Rao, who created and were the founders of the festival, and thank you very much, Johal of SFU, for putting this on. The conversation will continue through W2, and so if you want to carry on, you can. But the live event in this room is about to end, and thanks everyone for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thanks very much.